Okay, welcome again to another episode of the Migraine Miracle Moment. In a recent episode, I reviewed the body of evidence indicating that mitochondrial dysfunction plays a central role in determining migraine susceptibility. In other words, one of the primary determinants, or perhaps the primary determinant, of whether one person's brain gets migraines and another doesn't, or what I refer to as our internal susceptibility, is how well their mitochondria produces energy, which means that understanding how to improve mitochondrial function, how to improve its ability to generate energy, is super important for anyone with migraines. So in this episode, I'm going to review the process of how our mitochondria generate energy and identify the various ways that we can improve its ability to do so just through nutritional factors. And by the way, improving mitochondrial function doesn't just help with migraines. As I mentioned before, the brain is an energy hog, using about 20% of the body's energy, despite only accounting for about 2% of its weight. So no surprise that the brain is really vulnerable to impairments in energy production. And so not only will improving mitochondrial function pay dividends in terms of migraine protection, but also just in terms of overall cognitive function and performance. So improving things like focus and concentration, reducing brain fog, and in helping to reduce the risk of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, where mitochondrial dysfunction has also been shown to play a role. So I'm going to dig a little bit into the science of how mitochondria produce energy, because science is power, and I'm going to get a little bit into the details of the biochemistry, but you needn't remember those at all. The point here is to do so to illustrate all the many ways in which you can directly influence your mitochondria's ability to generate energy, and why a science-based approach to this is so useful. So recall that the mitochondria are these little bean-shaped structures inside almost every cell of the body, and their primary responsibility is to generate energy. The only reason you are alive right now is because your mitochondria are generating energy to support all of the chemical reactions that are needed to sustain life. And the big picture of how they do this is they take the energy that's stored in the bonds of glucose or fatty acids, which we mainly get from food, and they transfer that energy into the bonds of a molecule known as ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. Now, the conversion of energy here isn't perfect, and about 60% of the energy in those bonds is actually lost in the form of heat. However, we use that heat that's generated from the metabolic process to maintain our body temperature. So nothing is essentially going to waste. So metabolism is this process of converting the bonds in glucose and fat into heat, or ATP. And the reason for that is because all of the cells of the body are able to use ATP for energy. So you can think of ATP as like the batteries that power your cells, and the job of the mitochondria is to make those batteries. And the process of making ATP occurs in three main stages. The first step in the process differs depending on whether the fuel source is sugar or fat, or specifically glucose or a fatty acid. And the main job of the first step is to convert glucose or a fatty acid into a molecule called acetyl-CoA, so that it can then enter into what's known as the Krebs cycle. And glycolysis, which is the breakdown of glucose molecule into another molecule called pyruvate, actually happens in the cytoplasm, which is the fluid surrounding the cell's structures. So it's actually outside of the mitochondria. If there is oxygen around, that pyruvate then enters into the mitochondria, where it's then converted into a molecule called acetyl-CoA that can then enter into the Krebs cycle, also called the citric acid cycle. Sorry if I'm bringing back any nightmares from anybody's college biochemistry classes. But if we're starting with a fatty acid instead of glucose, it must first attach to a molecule called carnitine in order to be transported across the mitochondrial membrane and into the mitochondria. And after that, it's converted into acetyl-CoA and enters the Krebs cycle. So this first step of converting either glucose or a fatty acid into acetyl-CoA requires several vitamins and nutrients that we get from our diet, including magnesium, vitamin B1 or thiamine, and zinc, as well as some of that carnitine that I mentioned that's responsible for transporting the fatty acid across the mitochondrial membrane. So that's step one. The next step is the Krebs cycle, right? So we said that we've converted our glucose or our fatty acid into acetyl-CoA. That can then enter into the Krebs cycle, which is a series of 8 different reactions, each with its own enzyme that catalyzes those reactions. And the purpose of this cycle is to generate high-energy electron carriers that can then enter into the electron transport chain. So essentially, after the acetyl-CoA has gone through these 8 steps in the Krebs cycle, we've generated these high-energy molecules that can then be put to use in step 3. And the Krebs cycle actually generates carbon dioxide as waste, which is why we all need to breathe out carbon dioxide. It is a product of metabolism. And then a whole host of vitamins and minerals are needed for this step, the Krebs cycle, these 8 different reactions. So those include vitamin B1, vitamin B2, riboflavin, vitamin B3, niacin, vitamin B5 or pantothenic acid, iron, and magnesium. By the way, you'll see magnesium appear over and over again, which is an indication of just how important and vital a mineral it is. So review step 1 was turning glucose or fat into acetyl-CoA. Step 2 was turning acetyl-CoA into these molecules that are carrying these high energy electrons. And now in step 3, which is known as oxidative phosphorylation, basically means using oxygen to make a phosphate bond. This is when the mitochondria produce ATP, which is the end goal of all of this. And so what's happening in this step is that the electrons that were generated in the Krebs cycle are passed along a chain of proteins that are known as the electron transport chain. They transport electrons. And each time an electron is passed from one protein to the next, it uses the energy from those electrons to pump protons across the mitochondrial membrane. And what that does is builds up a kind of electrical pressure across the membrane in this exact same way as water pressure might build up behind a dam. And when that pressure reaches a certain level, protons then rush through the membrane, and they are aided in that process by a little turbine-like protein called ATP synthase. And the energy that's generated by the spinning of this turbine is used to make a molecule of ATP. And that's the ultimate goal of this process. And there are multiple vitamins and minerals that are needed for this particular step, this step of oxidative phosphorylation, which takes place in the electron transport chain. Those include coenzyme Q10, iron, copper, and again, our B vitamins, B2, B3, and B5. Okay, so what's the lesson here? What's the significance of all this? Well, as I've discussed, there's very good evidence that mitochondrial function plays a critical role in migraine. And one of the prevailing theories for why that is that that migraines occur when there's this mismatch between the energy that the brain needs and the energy that it can generate. And the brain generates energy through this process that I've just described, which happens almost entirely in the mitochondria. As I've illustrated, this is a very complex process with multiple steps and tons of moving parts. And all of those moving parts impact your mitochondria's ability to produce energy. And they are all heavily impacted by diet, lifestyle, and environment. So you can directly influence your mitochondrial function in so many different ways. And I've already discussed some of the important dietary components that can do so. Broadly speaking, you can influence your mitochondrial energy production in one of two ways. One is by improving the function of your existing mitochondria, and the other is to increase the number of mitochondria. So the way we improve the function, the first way, is to, number one, ensure that our mitochondria has everything it needs for all of those biochemical processes, and number two, protect it from harm. And again, that pertains to diet, lifestyle, and environment. So we want to ensure that our diet provides all of the nutrients mitochondria need and doesn't introduce elements that harm them or that disrupt their function. For example, refined carbohydrates and alcohol lead to oxidative stress and mitochondrial damage. Multiple medications, including ones used for migraine, can suppress mitochondrial function. So in this case, we have many things that may not provoke a migraine attack right then and there, but are the very reason we're susceptible to attacks in the first place. We also want to ensure that our lifestyle is providing mitochondria what they need and not causing harm. For example, the process of metabolism that I've just described generates what are known as reactive oxygen species, which can cause harm to cellular elements, including the mitochondria. But they're a natural byproduct of metabolism. They're unavoidable. But if they're not neutralized, they'll cause damage to structures, including the mitochondria. And just like there's an entire set of processes and molecules for generating energy, like I've just outlined, there's also an entire set of processes and molecules for preventing and repairing oxidative stress, which also directly impacts our mitochondrial function. Additionally, sleep is the time when much of that damage is repaired. So one of the consequences of insufficient sleep is insufficient repair of oxidative injury to the mitochondria, which worsens their function. So just one of the many examples of how lifestyle factors directly influence mitochondrial function. And then there's also the contribution from our environment. So there are compounds in our food, water, air, and personal products that directly impair mitochondrial function. For example, particulate matter in the air that is less than 2.5 microns in size and comes from things like industrial emissions and car exhaust is known to penetrate into the mitochondria and directly impair the proteins in the electron transport chain. Just one of many things that's known to disrupt the mitochondrial function. So minimizing exposure to that sort of thing is one of the highest impact ways we can improve mitochondrial function. Even the kind of light that we're exposed to makes a difference. So overall, to improve mitochondrial function, what we want to do is more of what helps and less of what hurts, right? And as I mentioned, there are two ways to boost mitochondrial function and energy production. The first is to improve mitochondrial function, which I talked about. The other is to increase the number of mitochondria that we have. So the more we have, the more energy we can produce. And the single best way to do that is physical activity. Which makes perfect sense, right? Physical activity sends our cells a signal that they need to be able to generate more energy. And one way they can respond is to produce more mitochondria. We also know that certain kinds of physical activity are more effective at stimulating mitochondrial biogenesis than others, which I'll talk about in a future episode. This is an example of the sort of thing where the impact isn't going to be immediate. Generating new mitochondria takes time, but once it does, the payoff can be tremendous. One of the reasons that migraines are a disease of civilization, and in particular of industrialized humans, is because there are so many aspects of our modern industrialized world that impair mitochondrial function amongst other biological processes, both by not providing enough of what they need to thrive, and also by causing direct harm. But understanding the science is what empowers us to do something. And there are so many things here that we can do. The more we know about how our modern diet, lifestyle, and environment impacts mitochondrial function, the more strategic we can be in our efforts to mitigate it and take back control. So again, the most current science indicates that mitochondrial dysfunction is a driving force in migraine. And as I've just described, there are so many things that impact mitochondrial function that you can influence. And I've only talked about the tip of the iceberg here. So don't ever let anyone ever again convince you that migraines are determined by your genes and there's nothing you can do about them. That is not supported by any of the science. All right, that's all for this episode. Thanks so much for listening. And now it's time to go out and slay the beast.